question that is quite similar. If you could snap your fingers and make a change to the zeitgeist of the modern RPG world, what would you change?
I would change the rules of Kickstarter.
Oh, we have another question about Kickstarter, but please elaborate on that.
First of all, there would be no deadlines.
Yeah.
Second, physical reward to a backer
Mm-hmm.
would be, um, how am I going to put it? That would be an add-on with no structural or contractual basis.
So you believe that Kickstarter for RPGs should be about making the game and not about making the products?
Well, no, you could be funded to make the product. That's fine, but it should not be a catalog for ordering the product,
I understand, yes.
and certainly not on a deadline.
Yeah, I hate deadlines too.
Right. And so those are, I think that an immense number of things would change. Kickstarter would, of course, become far less popular, and it would become far less as a medium of, well, I'm going to visit the catalog and see what's in the pages of the catalog today. Right. Now,
Yeah.
order the games I want based on their hype and based on who's doing it. Everything about that is toxic. The basic idea of crowdfunding is a fantastic thing. It's wonderful. It
Yeah.
breaks the distribution system,
Implementation.
right? But the structural components of Kickstarter in particular, which is really not their fault. They had no idea people would be using it as a publishing outlet, when they started it.
Yeah.
But the way things have evolved, and given the structural components, they have taken on a form by which, I don't back for product on Kickstarter anymore. I'll tell you I do back projects. You know how? For no reward. I check the
Nice.
box for no reward. And the only
Nice.
reason I'm giving that person money is because I want them to have a little bit more money to work on the thing they're working on. And if I want that fucking game, I'll buy it when it's available someday. I don't need to have it
Makes
now.
sense.
I don't need to be in the first wave and say, I got it as a Kickstarter, so I got it before you. Right?
Yeah.
All that crap. All that is, if I could snap my fingers right now, I would destroy that particular infrastructure that has led to getting a ton of badly designed games because they were on a deadline and because they shifted to design and production before they were ready, before the design work really had hit a creative crest.
Unfortunately, Kickstarter is responsible both for giving us lots of great games, both pen and paper and video games even, but also for most of those games suffering from that syndrome that you are.
Of course. Yeah, they're half baked. You can see that
Yeah.
they were on the right path, and then they got a lot of great art and they stopped working on the game.
Yeah.
And it's a very, very common pattern, and it's extremely frustrating. For a period from about 2001 to about 2012, the distribution system of role-playing games had fallen apart completely. The internet, and this is pre-social media for the most part, had become the venue for discussing and selling role-playing games. PayPal was invented, early in that.
Yeah.
And so at that point, we had a period where a lot of games were made with a lot of interaction, a lot of playtesting, a lot of self-management of the project relative to your own life, and no deadline.
Yeah.
And there's no surprise that period produced amazing games. And so then after 2012, we got it all back. We got deadlines. We got production value given pride of place, right? It's a beautiful book. And then we also got the decision to purchase it is based on promotional excitement, right? Who needs any industry where those are the three primary driving factors? I have no interest in any product where those are the primary driving factors.
To answer your question, my my favorite thing in RPGs today is the old school Renaissance movement. That is very that is most in a very large percentage a product of love, and
You
it's
know
made
what
by people
the
who are.
old school Renaissance is?
What is it?
The Junior Forge. Most
Um,
of the people, I don't care if people have a shit fit when they hear that. Most of the
yeah,
people who got the old school Renaissance going, especially before it got its name, were actually at the forge. And most of the people who really produced the basic work of it were self publishing and following the model of self publishing that had been promoted for the first time at the Forge. So they are really
yeah.
the next Forge.
What do
Now,
you think of OSR movement?
well, that's the other thing. You can watch my series, which I still think is kind of a rough draft, about Dungeons and Dragons as a religion. And I actually mean that very seriously, as a folk religion.
Yeah,
That Dungeons and Dragons has a religious quality to role players that has nothing to do with playing the game and nothing to do with the actual features of the texts of the games. It's a culture. And it has its rituals and it has its schools and branches and its ways to observe it. And the OSR, in many ways, is very similar to the early American fundamentalist religious movement, which was a lot more diverse in the late 19th century than it became in the 20th century. And the ideology of the OSR is unfortunately mostly anti-intellectual. You're supposed to feel it. You're supposed to revere it. You're supposed to be faithful to it. And so it's mostly an anti-intellectual approach, but just like all of these tiny little churches scattered across America 100, 150 years ago, they were very enthusiastic and they put their whole lives and all their effort into whatever the hell it was they were doing in those churches. Whether it involved holding snakes and whatever it was, in all these different weird little spots, they really meant it, and it was central to their lives. And the OSR, if it is anything, is that kind of enthusiasm. I don't rate it highly in intellectual terms as a large movement. But if you go to specific practitioners and specific games, you're going to find some really, really intelligent, thoughtful work. And also, I will give it credit, some of the people involved discovered that they had no idea what D&D was historically. They only knew
yeah.
whatever it was they had encountered when they were 14 at a table, and they had never really read the books critically at all and had no idea about the history. So one of the really nice things that happened during the 2000s was people actually did the scholarship that was necessary to give us a real history of D&D, a textual history rather than a publishing history, an economic
Yeah.
history, rather than just a cultural mythology which had existed. I mean, there are people who thought that Gary Gygax owned and ran D&D until it was purchased by Wizards of the Coast. I mean, they had no idea. They had just no idea what they were looking at. People didn't know how many branches of Dungeons and Dragons there were, with no connection to each other. So,
There,
so the
I believe that
OSR
there is a
did the people who you see the problem is OSR is a marketing term. It's not actually a thing. It's like saying Christian
yeah.
in back in that time that I'm talking about 150 years ago, and that's all great. You all feel good that there are so many of us Christians around worshiping the Lord and being good people until you actually go to one of their churches and you say, "What the hell are all these enemies of God doing in here?" Right? And so
Yeah.
that's very much what the OSR is like. They all got together eventually by around 2008 and suddenly realized that everybody else except themselves personally was crazy. And so the term, though, became very useful for attracting attention and getting efforts into one place. And there are if the notion that there is some common grounds for the term OSR, either as gameplay practice or as any kind of aesthetic, unifying factor, which is bullshit. You have everything from hardcore grindhouse alternative, underground comics, explicit
Yeah.
sex and violence, all the way over to the most candy coated basic Saturday morning cartoon. And that's all supposed to be OSR aesthetically. You're like, what the hell are you talking about? And the point is that I specifically want to say that whatever one identifies as your OSR, as your meaning of the term, is a wonderful thing because it's your enjoyment of play. But to claim that you have tapped into a common factor, or even more so, an original factor, that's grotesque. That's like wearing your ass for a hat and doing a dance. I mean, it's completely it's nonsensical. So I love what the so-called OSR does, which is really a bunch of different people doing different things. I love the fact that it promotes independent publishing and the guts to put on paper whatever it is you want. I love all that. But it's a little bit like talking to rock and roll guitarists, to go back to rock and
Yeah.
roll. In other words, I
Yeah.
love listening to them, but for God's sake, don't listen to them talk.
I
It's
think
like an
that
interview with Robert Plant. I mean, there are plants who are smarter than Robert Plant. You just don't want to. You don't want to listen to the guy talk. Believe me. Sing.
uh,
Oh God. So don't talk. So it's a little bit like that with a lot of the OSR.
the beauty of it, in my book at least, is this extensive conversation that is happening through all those blogs.
Of course. Yeah. Well, yes. Although the extensive
Generally, I think that
conversation.
when passionate people talk about their hobby,
Hmm.
good things are put on paper
Right.
or on the
Hmm. You see, this is exactly what I like as well. It's why I'm friends with a number of people who are either identified by others as OSR or call themselves that. But it's also important to recognize that there is no one, there's really no, I don't care how much they believe it, if some of them do, but there is no prevailing aesthetic or historical identity to that term. They just like to believe it.
I see your point of view. I don't espouse it,
Mm-hmm.
but I see it.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of which, do you have a favorite, an OSR favorite?
Oh, well, I have several that I like very much. I don't know about a specific favorite. First of all, if you want to talk about kind of a dedicated, thoughtful look at the material, James Malazewski is a good example. He and I are friends, and I have played a lot of Empire of the Petal Throne with him. Um, and then I will give great credit to Jim Raji with Lamentations of the Flame Princess of walking his walk and talking his talk. I will
And
point
he
out that both
also
of those people are OSR because people call them OSR, not because they took the term and used it themselves as a promotional identity. They have been included because that's what they're called.
yes,
And so then also there are several others. I mean, I could keep going for some time. Raphael Chandler, who's done a great deal of art for a number of games with OSR on the cover of one sort or another, is a great contributor. Another incredible contributor, of course, is the unstoppable cartographer Dyson Logos. Um, and
his work is amazing.
Oh
His
yeah,
work,
yeah. I mean, I use his little maps all the time for hundreds of different games. I just,
he's one of the
I say to
people.
myself, well, I need a ruined fortress. Let's go. I'm one of his, I'm on one of his patrons on his Patreon, so that means I get a lot of free stuff, and so I just comb through the catalog and look for ruined fortresses and say, oh, I'll use that one. You know, so there's a lot of that sort of thing. Now, it's not really fair. It's a little bit like the musicians. I'm going to finish this interview and then I'll say, oh no, I forgot to mention somebody.
I
And
hope,
there are quite a
I am
few.
certain there will be no hard feelings.
Right. Well, I hope
There,
not. But the fact is that I'm certain that I'll remember somebody that I should have said.